they have great aspirations for their child. They're expected to go to Harvard and win a Nobel Prize, whatever, and there is a big problem. More often than not, the black children just don't do well in school. They don't do anything like what their parents did in school. And they bring in the psychologist and they find out that seems to have a lower IQ. Where did this lower IQ possibly come from? They gave him everything. And of course, you could blame white racism or black cultural attitudes, but it's predictable from regression to the mean because the children regress to the mean. This is very well known biological fact. You have a great racehorse that wins the Derby and all the other great events, and you put him out to stud. All his offspring, they're great horses, but they're nothing like the father that sired them. So there's regression to the mean, and it works at the other end. If you have very low IQ parents, the children actually do better than you might have expected because there's this biological regression. Well, black children regress more towards the black mean, which is lower, than white children do. So it's a statistical argument, but it explains real-life phenomena. Next one. It's not just IQ. There are 60 other life history traits. So that if you put East Asians on one side, whites in the middle, and blacks at the other side, on IQ, which is where they fall out, it's odd that they also fall out on all these other traits. Not just obvious ones like educational performance or criminality, but physiological variables. Things like hormone levels. Blacks have more testosterone. East Asians have less testosterone than whites. Blacks live less long than whites. East Asians actually live a little bit longer than whites. Developmental speed. Black children actually learn to walk faster. They crawl faster, they walk faster, they enter adolescence faster than white children. White children walk, crawl and walk and enter adolescence earlier than East Asian children. Twinning rates. Blacks have produced more twins than do whites. Whites produce more twins than do East Asians. So there's a lot of variables that show this pattern of differences. How can you explain not just the IQ differences, but this consistent pattern? And only genetic theory can do that. Culture-only theory cannot. Next one. So human origins research. If you have, there's various theories of evolution of where we all came from, but probably the most accepted one right now, certainly the simplest one, is that modern Homo sapiens sapiens evolved in Africa, maybe 200,000 years ago or 140,000 years ago, and then about 100,000 years ago began to migrate out. And the further north they moved, the greater was the selection pressure, not just for IQ, but also for all these other 60 traits. And you can just think of the selection. If once you get cold winters, this is in Richard Lynn's book and it's in my book and so on, once you get a cold winter, it's very difficult to keep a baby alive. How do you keep a baby alive in the middle of a winter? You have to invent clothing, you have to invent shelter, you have to be able to store food, you have to be able to do a whole host of other things. You have to have more mother-father joint marriage where the father, paternity is very important in terms of parental care. So you're selecting a whole different lifestyle from living in Africa or Australia or some very warm climate where you don't have to deal with the harsh cold winter. And so the argument would be that the further north you go, North Africa, the Arabs, the Arab Mediterranean populations have a lot of selection relative to sub-Saharan Africa, but nowhere near the same selection as you have in Northern Europe. And maybe the Chinese had even greater degrees of selection because it was even colder there. They're a very cold, adapted population. In any case, human origins research does explain all the data that's been put forward. So it's one theory to explain all that data. The culture-only theory has no theory to explain all of the data. They have to pick little piecemeal theories to explain bits and pieces of the data, usually in a post hoc, after the fact fashion. Last slide. And finally, we decided why we raised it, Jensen and me, from 50% to 80%, is that no matter how we looked, we could, and we tried to be generous because we wanted to look generous, we couldn't find any single environmental factor that was reliably related to IQ score improvement. So how much money you spend on the schools, or poverty, or whether you live in a high-rise building or a low-rise building, an understimulated environment or an overstimulated environment, all these different theories that have been put forward, whether you live in the ghetto or whether you live in the suburbs, just doesn't seem to make any difference at all, whether you live in segregated areas or non-segregated areas. All the different theories that have been put forward, and hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the basis of those theories, Head Start programs and so on, show no reliable improvement in IQ scores. So we had no option but to go with what Jensen calls the default hypothesis. We know that among white people, by adulthood, in reasonable environments like America or Western Europe, 80% of the variance in intelligence is genetic. And so Jensen basically argues that whatever, and this is very reliable, you won't find much argument from most behavior geneticists, even if they cringe at the racial aspect, they won't cringe at saying, yeah, it looks like 80% for adulthood. The causes of individual differences are the same causes for group differences. That's the default hypothesis. Unless you can show it's not true, that's the simplest model. And if it's 80% for individual differences, then it's 80% for the group differences. And so that's why we ended up putting that high figure of 80%, expecting that at least, you put up a strong figure like that, people who really don't like it are going to do everything they possibly can to shoot it down. And, well, the bottom line is that nobody's been able to shoot it down, and I don't see how they possibly can. So in one way, the ending of this discussion is, at least for me personally, I've spent 20 or 30 years doing IQ studies like this now. That's it. Put that one to bed, close the book, it's finished. Move on. It's done. Black-white differences are 80% genetic in America. Does that end the IQ controversy? No. It turns out that who cares? Black-white differences in America are a teeny tiny little hill on the world scale. If all of North America disappeared into the ocean tomorrow, there would still be these humongous differences between sub-Saharan Africans, North Africans, Chinese and Japanese. And how do you explain those? Where do they come from? So IQ is here to stay as a problem and discussion group. That's it. Thank you very much.